once again. The plan is I will do a kind of warm-up round. I have a couple of questions myself, so which may also interest you. So there will be a short warm-up round, a couple of questions on my side, which I ask you to give very short answers. And then I give the floor also to you, of course, so you can also think in the meantime about some interesting questions. Please keep in mind, whoever has a long question knows already the answer. So please ask relatively short questions. First, I'm interested, Shaykh Salahuddin. I mean, I learned that you are born in Lebanon, but you live here in Sweden since your 7th year. One question, what do you think, I mean, Lebanon could be received as an Islamic country, more or less. What can happen in Sweden, what cannot happen in Lebanon? What can happen in Sweden for Muslims, what may not even happen in Lebanon? What is the, let's say, the advantage of being in Sweden?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. It's a difficult question since I haven't my knowledge of Lebanon as a country to live in is very little, very small, and I've been there for a couple of visits throughout my upbringing, so that's maybe interesting in itself, but I don't really have an answer on.
Let's put it more general. Let's say the other famous Islamic countries, let's say Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, all these Islamic countries. So and we live in a non-Islamic country. What could happen here, what could not happen there?
So I think here we have the great opportunity of being, having the honor of being the foundational stones of a great future for Islam and the Muslims in an area which haven't been reached earlier. I think this opportunity of being able to spread the mercy of the Prophet ﷺ and the Muhammadan light is a opportunity that few can have in other parts of the world. So I think this is maybe it's the task of the prophets and the messengers to bring this light to new places and new peoples. And we've got this honor to be a part of that and inherit a part of that inheritance, and not just preach for those that already have received in some sense. And I think it's a different task, it's a difficult task, but it's a challenging task that lets you grow and walk in the footsteps of the prophets and the messengers, may peace be upon them.
Shaykh Abdalhaqq, one question. I mean, this panel is under the headline Islam in the North. You could say modern Islam or something like that. I mean, how do you see this kind of adjectives we use today, like German Muslims, European Muslims, English Muslims? Is this something you would say has a value, or would you reject that concept? Would you say, like many do, well, we are all just Muslims? Would you see any kind of significance of to say things like European Muslims, Swedish Muslims, German Muslims, etc.?
Well, what I've always noticed is that wherever Islam has been established in the world, as has been said before in this gathering, wherever it's been established in the world, it takes on the colour of the environment in which it is established, so that there's never any sense. There's a difference between Christianity on the whole and Islam in this respect, in that Christianity was taken to, particularly in the colonial era, to different places in the world, and in each place that it was taken, whether it was an African country or a French country, there's a link, always a link to the colonial power that brought it, or in India to the Christian, in England and so on. There's always this link between the colonial power, in other words, the power that brought the message of Christianity. It's a political imposition that takes place that is obvious, and the people there feel a connection with the place from which they received the Christian tradition. Whereas in any place where Islam is established in the world, there's never any evidence about how it got there. It's always, as it were, it grew out of the soil of the place where it appeared. So Islam in China has its own identity. It's very specifically Chinese. It's very different from the Islam in Nigeria, which has a very African taste to it. And even though the basic practice is the same in every case, so they're all clearly Muslims doing the same thing, and yet the place that they come from somehow is reflected in the practice in a very real way. In the same way, what one will expect, because I mean, for instance, in Britain, where you have Muslims from, I mean, the great majority of Muslims are from the subcontinent, but also the Muslims from Turkey, there are Muslims from Arab countries, and many Muslims now from Africa, particularly large Somali community. Islam cannot take on the example, the culture of any one of these places. It has to somehow engender a culture that is coming out of the place where all these Muslims come together and create that culture independently. So it's never going to be English British. It's going to be an Islam that grows out of the place in which it comes. Into say what happens it'll be almost the same, I think, throughout Europe, but there'll be different tastes of Islam in different places as Islam becomes established. I always say a great example of this is Cape Town, because in Cape Town you have a very distinct Muslim culture that it did originate in Java and in what's now Indonesia, but nevertheless it has its own taste, its own culture, their own. You were telling me yesterday, there was the way they do the prayer, even the cuisine they have. They even have a Cape Townian Muslim cuisine. All of it is coming out of the place, and it's become very, very intense. And so it's too early to say what Islam will look like in Europe. Yeah, but it will take on the form of gradually take on the form of the place out of which it grows. So the Muslims in Britain will develop a certain kind of cultural identity. It will be different from Muslims anywhere else in the world, and the same in Germany, and the same here. So I'm going on.
I would like to add something. I think part of the challenge for us, that is a positive challenge, is that I think a lot of us get to be a part of a kind of renewal. You know, the renewal of the deen, of the religion, is a part of the religion. And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that at each 100 years there will come a renewal. And I think this, and of course our understanding of renewal is going back to the basics, going back, renewing our connection to the roots. And I think this is, I think us being here in a new place lets us reconsider maybe a lot of the things that are seen, and it's always difficult to part between culture and religion. We here get some new light shed on maybe what is religion and what is culture of that we have maybe perceived as religion. And through that we get a new focus on the roots again, and be able to re-establish them and grow something from those roots. But I think it is a challenge when everybody, a lot of us, the Muslims that have come here as immigrants or refugees, we come with both religion and other things connected to it. And I think this challenge of renewal and reconsidering is a good challenge, an important challenge.
And I think that's really true, but there's also an element involved in that. Many of the Muslims are trying to, precisely what we're saying, are trying to preserve something that actually no longer exists. And when Islam comes again, when this renewal process takes place, which it does on a regular basis, it comes in a slightly different way than it did before. It's rough and ready. There's a rough and readiness about it. What Shaykh Abdalhaqq called brute wisdom. It appears in a very vigorous way, but in a slightly new form. It doesn't. Of course, it comes completely with the original. Doesn't change in any way, but nevertheless it comes with a different energy. And that energy is like when the Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Yemen, was a very simple instruction he gave him, and it was like to make something happen in a new place is very different from keeping it from changing when it is in a place.
I think also that it puts a task upon us to try to see that which is good in the other. That's a difficult thing, especially when we try to be protected, right? So there are lots of things in Swedish culture and Swedish tradition that we can connect to as Muslims, and that we want to live according to, and we want to make survive and continue, especially in the struggle with modernism, where we see even traditional Swedish values being brushed away replaced by Halloween and Thanksgiving and Valentine's Day, right? So I think that it's important for us to try to, with all the difficulties and challenges that we are, trying to find that which is beauty in the other, in the new that we meet, and put it to use in our country.
I think Luqman.
You see how they slowly disappear.
I think that's what Luqman did remind us of this, is how you can work with people to the good, even though you might be able to not stop them from the harmful. You can at least work with people with the good, which is endemic in everything.
Let's take one aspect of Luqman Nieto's talk, while this was mentioned.
Perhaps Luqman should sit there. I'm realizing right now. We add to the complexity.
Right. I want to use one term from the talk of Sidi Luqman, which he called the godlessness. There are different expressions for that. You could also say nihilism. I have two different questions. Please have a bit of patience for one more. There's two questions going in different directions. So there's godlessness, there's the experience of nihilism in Europe. I want to ask Abdalhaqq the first question, because he's also a very kind of knowledgeable historian, in fact. I mean, how do you see, in Europe, there's First World War I, there's World War II. When people go through a shock of wars, terror, masses of dead people, there's the Holocaust. It is a big event in Europe. All the philosophers, writers, painters, whoever has a bit of spirituality is shocked, deeply shocked. And there's this experience of godlessness. How would you answer to Europe this question? Yes, you talk about the divine, about God and so on, but was there not a manifestation of such brutality that it's quite natural that people have a slight doubt on the concept of God? That's the first question. Same question after.
Well, you stumped me now, I have no answer to that.
Maybe just to give you a bit of thinking time, the direction I'm going to.
Yeah.
There was a famous German poet called Ernst Jünger. He was also asked this famous question. He was asked, there was the Holocaust, there was these terrible wars in Europe and so on. You still talk about spirituality, about the question of God and so on. Is it not clear it's such a desert? Jünger was answering, everybody dies his own death. In other words, what he tried to hint to was, yes, all the things go on, but there's something also like, yes, people die. That's a human condition. But even so, this monstrous event of Europe, which has driven Europe into nihilism, is it not, in a sense, understandable that people have this doubt?
Well, I think it's certainly understandable, but the question is of how to awaken in people's hearts a sense of the divine that was always there throughout the history of Europe. I always think that when you're going through the English countryside, the first thing you always see when you're sticking above the trees when you come to a village is the church, the tower of the church steeple, And it's quite clear that up right into the 20th century, people's lives were based on this sense of the divine. And it's also quite clear that in the last 50 years, the last 40 years, and it was in the language, it was in people's everyday behavior. It was what underpinned the moral, the moral, the moral structure of the nation was this sense of answerability to the divine, even if it was only in language and not even in people's real belief structure. But that, I mean, since the end of, during the last half of the 20th century, undoubtedly that has diminished in people's understanding. But once, well, after I was Muslim, my grandmother had an old friend who I used to call my Aunt Dorothy, and I went to visit her after it was a few years after I became a Muslim, and at a certain point it became thought. I said, "Well, can you please give me a place to pray?" She said, "Oh, I heard you became Muslim." I said, "Yeah, I can do it." She had kept poodles, so it was a bit difficult. Dogs out of the way. But anyway, we found a place to pray, and then she suddenly said to me, she said, one day in the late 1920s, I got on a bus in the King's Road in London, the number 11 bus, and I knew God existed. That's what you said actually. She said, I knew God existed. It was such a strong thing that I mentioned. This was what? 50 years later. She was telling me this. Suddenly I knew God existed. There was no doubt in my mind at all. And then I got out of the bus and it went. So this is Allah Ta'ala says He sends to every people a messenger. And that, and some of the Mufassirin said, no, that means to every single human being receives, at some point in their lives, an indication that the divine exists. Neither they take that and act on it, or so no one is left without knowledge. So it's just a question of allowing that spark and of being there to enable that spark to catch fire and to continue to burn. Somehow or other, and everybody has that possibility. Every single person will at some point in their life receive that indication. Sorry, that's not really an answer.
Shaykh Salahuddin, sorry to torture you a bit, but I just want to grasp some knowledge on that. Again, we are talking here about godlessness, nihilism, this experience of doubt in a sense. I mean, I just learned, you are very active in counter-terrorism activities. Again, there's these Muslims coming to Europe, this seem to be in one way or the other related to the Quran, to Allah. They use words like Allah Akbar, they do these things, criminal attacks, suicide attacks, terrorism. Do you understand that maybe some Europeans say, well, it's all nice what you talk about, but the actual reality of Islam in this time, is it not frightening, is it not shocking? Do you see that? How do you respond to that?
Yes, I would, of course, and it's connected to the first question as well. I would say that evil and darkness is a part of human history. And I think that if we look upon the lives of the prophets, may peace be upon them, we will see that they were sent, the most famous of the prophets that we know, were sent in times of darkness. And I would say, as an answer to the one who questions God through the darkness, isn't that the real evidence of a need for light? I think the darkness is there is a famous saying of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, famous as Rumi, where he says things are known through the opposites. We can really find light without darkness. We can't find health without have felt sickness. And we can't feel happiness if we haven't felt sorrow. I think finding light in the darkness is amongst the most growing experience a human can have. And I think this is the existence of a darkness with all the evil and the misery that it carries. It carries also a way to become a better human and to grow closer to God. There's even in the sayings of the Sufis that experience that in such a practical level in their daily lives. So one of them, when he fell down the stairs, he said, for every time I hit my head in a stair, I felt closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the history of Europe is also has also set out a path of searching at least for the light.
Yes, yes.
The need for a light.
Right.
It's very clear.
I remember once when I went out from Bazaar in Messi, at that time the society was changing. It was after the death of Sheikh Abdalhaqq, and the society was changing a lot, and corruption, there's a lot of corruption, a lot of kind of darkness come into Moroccan society. And I came back to Zaria really shocked by this, and suddenly realizing it. And I think, oh, things are getting really dark out there. And Raji, one of the great people of Sheikh Mohammed, said, but how much brighter the light looks. How much brighter the light looks.
Again, I blame you for bringing in this negative term, godness doesn't need it. And, but I want to ask you, Luqman, I mean, you're relatively young. So naturally you meet all these young people. And you have mentioned in your talk things like ecological crisis, financial crisis, crisis of all kinds. Yeah. So again, I mean, if you just see the fact in its monstrosity, you could say, wow, it's a quite dark time, lots of negative things going on and so on. How do you see that young people survive all this? I mean, they should not completely ignore that because then it would not exist in the time we're in. But how can we help them, let's say, to have a positive attitude, to have hope, to see change, a possible change, and not to be completely overwhelmed by all? Joy.
As Shaykh Abdalhaqq said yesterday.
So how can you be joyful if you see the ecological crisis in Africa? The hunger, the wars, the death.
Because joy is not a state imposed by external circumstances or by external factors. They definitely can have an effect on perception, of course, but is a joy connected to and who is your Lord, and understanding that you are not the one choosing. You didn't choose where you were born. You didn't choose upon which parents you were born. You didn't choose the time, the color, the race. You didn't choose anything. From that point of view, it's just thrown into the circumstances. And obviously, upon difficulty is very, very, very difficult to have that. But as you mentioned, Ernst Jünger, who was in the most disastrous of situations, were able to feel joy in the depth of the how do you call it in terms? The trenches. In the depth of the trenches, he was able to feel joy. So if a human being is able, not even a Muslim, like a human being is able to find joy as the spark of life, which is within each of us in that terrible circumstances, and have the hope that change is existence, change is nature, and it can believe that things change. Because the problem with I think something that you encounter with a lot of young people, my age, I'm still young, is that they don't see that what is out there can change. It's an immutable structure that is just goes as a roller coaster upon you, and you have no ability to do anything, and no ability to change anything, and no ability to, and of course, from a very deep understanding, we know that we are not the one that make change happen. There is a lot of one that make changes, but your perception of that and how you perceive that Allah is in the present, and you dua and your action towards Him and wanting to change their circumstances, and it's possible, and it's that joy of being alive, of sharing a good moment. And just briefly upon the subject of the First and Second World War, it is very much said that, well, religion is the causes of all wars. The two biggest ones I can think of, the cause of it was actually the absence of God. So the very, very same rationale of how can you believe and speak about the spirituality in these circumstances, but can you not see that the reason why we got to these circumstances is particularly because we didn't have any.
Thank you. Good point. Last round, I mean, some brief question before we give the floor to the audience.
Just the thing with Islamic extremism and so on.
Right.
Just briefly, I would say that I've studied it quite thoroughly, and I would say one of the main diseases is the disease of modernism, of secularism, that to a big part has affected a big portion of the Muslim mind, the Muslim mindset in many countries. And I think if you would go into study the Islamic extremist ideologists, you will see they are more inspired by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche than they are by Ghazali or any other Muslim traditional philosophy. Even though we have had extremism, and all religions have had, and all ideologies, extremism in itself seems to be a human trait to some extent. The form that it has taken in recent times is a very modern form, and it's not a traditional Islamic. That's the fast answer. And then, of course, I have whole seminars on that.
On that basis, also it's quite clear that the basic energy behind the extremism has nothing to do with Islam, although it's more to do with resentment, and it's the same energy that created the violence in the nationalisms of the early 20th century. All of this exactly the same phenomenon. It's got nothing whatever to do with psychological imbalance that people feel resentment and powerlessness and want to see that, and creates this desire to so
I actually call it religious nationalism when I speak about it, because when you see, for instance, ISIS propaganda, what will be the most obvious traits in their videos? It's not somebody who's making dhikr, or who's breaking the fast, or who's making tahajjud.
Yeah.
It's the flags.
Yeah,
it's
amazing.
the comment, it's the power, it's jeeps. It's very nationalistic traits that are brought forward.
Thank you so far. I mean, just to end with my last round, my last question is a bit more positive. Shaykh Abdalhaqq, we talked a bit about identity. I think any philosopher of any kind would agree. I mean, identity is something changing, moving. I mean, it's not so easy to fix on any term like citizenship, language. Everything is a movement and a change. Where do you place the soul, this term soul? I mean, in which way it is part of your identity? Is there continuity of the soul? Is there development? How would you put this term soul in this image of identity, who we are?
Well, Shaykh Abdalhaqq, he talks about the nature of the human being, and talks about the nafs, which is the human self, and the ruh, which is the spirit, and says that they are one and the same thing. pure, which is what is breathed into us, if you like, from Allah, our pure spiritual identity. That which, when Allah Ta'ala gathered all the children of Adam alayhi salam together and asked them, "Am I not your Lord?" All of the arwah of the human race that was ever going to come into existence said, "Yes, you are." So there's that recognition which comes into the human being as a birthright. And then the nafs gradually becomes formed, so the human being becomes, over a period of time, becomes earth and achieves this unique individual identity on the basis of genetic imprinting and also experience through early life, particularly, and so develops an identity that the ruh, the spirit, becomes then embodied in a particular form. And that form then becomes called nafs. But in fact, they're one thing, and the spiritual path, the path of the Sufis, the path of Ihsan, is the path of gradually purifying that, of doing what is called jihad of the nafs, struggling against the nafs in such a way that gradually the nafs loses its individual identity and begins to gradually transform itself into that ruh, which was the original form. So the soul is as it were, that individual identity of the nafs gradually, and according to how you live in your life in this world. And the gentleman at the end, he said, who we met outside earlier.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, you.
Yeah.
he said, well, how can you have this judgmental God? How can you believe in a judgmental God who, when you die, suddenly tells you to go to hell? I said, well, no, that's not what happens. What happens is that the human being lives their life and they judge themselves as they live. Their identity is created, formed by their actions, so that when they die, so that our next life we are gradually creating our next life as we live our lives in this world. The image that's given of crossing the sirat in the next world, which you can go like lightning, or you go really, and you get caught up on it. All of that is what you are doing, is you're reliving your life in this world. How you lived, so you will pass the sirat. As you lived, so your actions will be judged. So the identity, I mean, that is the identity. That is the difference. That's the connection, as it were, between the ruh and the individual identity. So I hope that's true. I'm sorry.
Very well. Shaykh Salahuddin, I mean, I'm as you know, very present in Facebook, social media, and I get the impression, I mean, it is in one way or the other quite a celebration of negativity. So you see, if you say anything negative, blaming somebody and so on, you get a lot of response. But on the other hand, speaking about positive things, you know, hopeful things, positive, more difficult one. When how do you see these elements? How can we mix joy with evil? Islam is also, as Luqman said, having joy. Why is it? It seems to be slightly frustrating. So how to bring back as an imam this joy?
Joy is important, but I think the focus should be maybe on meaning.
Right.
On bringing meaning to people.
Right.
And meaning could be found in both joy and sorrow.
Right.
So I think bringing a more meaningful existence altogether in whatever state you're in. We cannot maybe expect somebody who's just lost their child to be joyous, but maybe they can find some meaning in the sorrow that they have. So I think, and of course, bringing depth to social media is a difficult thing. I think, I don't know if I've lost hope in it, but I think it might be used as a means to get people together can meet humans and maybe get other perspectives perhaps, and in such a way get some meaning. It's tools.
You can't use it for teaching though.
Not really. Not teaching what it is to be a human. I think that needs to be felt and be, as we know in our tradition, knowledge is something that is conveyed from heart to heart. And if it's taken from the books or from the text only, it's not knowledge, because it's just words. It's hard. But when it gets filtered through a heart and gets poured to the other heart, it becomes knowledge, because it becomes filled with the spirit. And this is, I think, the soul is the most intrinsic human identity value that we have. And without the soul, we would be just material. It wouldn't be, in objectively seen, much difference between a human and a table. It's just atoms, it's just blocks of labor, as we say, right? I think the spirit, the soul, is that which makes us really human. And I think this meeting of the souls, the souls are connected soldiers almost. I think this connection, to be able to establish this connection in meeting and encountering people, is very important.
Last question in my part of it, Sidi Luqman. We all know, or I know, that you have studied intensively the Quran and spent many years of your life with it, in fact. And there was one question in the lunch table, which somebody asked, well, I mean, in the end of the day, I mean, to reach to the divine, to reach to Allah, to have an experience of Tawheed, that's something that can happen in Christianity, can happen in Buddhism, can happen in many forms of life. So what would you say in your spiritual experience, what is this kind of extra you find in Islam? What would you say any kind of difference in your practice, in your spiritual practice? Could you hint where you would see a difference?
The human being is not, is neither soul nor matter. So in this world is very thin. So your actions have a direct impact in your state. There is actually a pillar of the Ashari belief that your actions affect you believe. So how can I pretend to have a great spiritual state when my neighbor next to me doesn't have food? How can I have a great spiritual awakening when I cannot empathize with the other, when I cannot see the other? How can I pretend to be illuminated when my action says otherwise? When all my action says is that all I care is this world. Whereas from an Islamic or Muslim perspective, from the perspective of a Muslim, the understanding of Islam, as we said, when you realize this majestic truth, which is the reality of existence, you ask, okay, so what do I do? If I acknowledge that God exists, and in this very existential view, what do I do now? What is that upon which I act that will not make me forget this reality? And certainly, God cannot have left you without that. Otherwise, what's the point of acknowledging that very essence? And yes, there is much sense on that there is a kind of natural inclination, there's a fitra toward that natural action that human beings constantly challenge, and having that reality, which is the Quran, which is the Furqan, is how do I act, which is the Prophet, he was the walking Quran, he was the Furqan. He is the model that shows us how do you act in this world, so that your actions do not make you forget the reality of your spirituality, and that your actions increase your spirituality, and that your spirituality increase your actions. There is no detachment, where in most spiritual paths there is a detachment. There is a private reality and a social one. There is a private spirituality and a social discourse. In Islam, there is no such a thing. You have to unite both. If you do not unite both, then you cannot claim to be, you cannot claim anything.
Thank you. So, end of the first round. I mean, I was totally defeated by these three gentlemen because my aim was to create a question where I can make them speechless. You failed completely. So, you have any questions which may make them speechless or challenge them a bit, or you have any specific question which is straightforward and don't hesitate to bring the most impossible thing in front of them? Please,
I have a question regarding, like, you were mentioning Holocaust and these things, and modern psychology now knows about generational trauma. So the people who have experienced traumatic things through their own psychology, they give that onto their kids, so they harm their kids.
Right.
And how is the knowledge upon how to raise kids in regards, for example, punishment, and also general society? How do you see punishment as a European Muslim?
Yes.
Because of my knowledge, there is a lot of mentioning of that in the Quran.
Right. You see, Shahab, you see any kind of specific advice or indication from the Quranic perspective, from your perspective as a scholar, how to deal with this kind of experience which traumatize people, young people, they see all the on TV and so? Would you see any possible answer?
Nothing comes to me.
To other people you have?
I mean, from the first part of the question, perhaps there's a hadith that could very well serve this purpose, which is very famous, in which the Prophet said, every human is born in a state of fitra, natural inclination, natural belief towards Allah, and it's the father, the parents that makes him Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, or a worshipper of other things. If we reflect upon it and what is identity, what parents do impose on the children is identity, and that identity comes with a trauma which is their own. So they raise them in that trauma. That trauma is not born within their soul, so to say, because of course then you have to believe that where does the soul comes from. So if the soul comes as the Muslim believer's inspiration of Allah in the human spirit, in the human body, then what psychologically is happening is that the parents are imposing their identity form, which is an idea of themselves through the lived experience in their children. They are not affecting the soul, they are affecting their identity. The children, therefore, through a deconstruction process, can get back to the reality of his soul as coming from the Creator, and understand that the identity he has been given is not real. It's not his, but it's a given identity. So it can liberate itself from that trauma. Of course, it's a great work, and not all of us are capable of it, although we might be in it all our lives. But having that knowledge at least gives you the hope that we are not the product of, we are not simply robots that inherit a particular identity. We have a choice in that identity. We have a choice in that, because is an explanation of the hadith, which is a very fitri understanding, very natural understanding of it.
Thank you.
I didn't really understand the connection to punishment that you made.
It's like, for example, in Sweden, you're not allowed to hit your kids. This is not the case in many, many other countries, even in Europe. All psychological knowledge is that this is traumatizing the children. But there is a lot of mentioning of violence and punishment in the Quran, and I don't know how to relate to that as I see it from the outside. I
wouldn't, maybe, of course, violence in the Quran in relation to this over 6,000 verses that are in the Quran. Those that actually speak about violence or punishment are very few, if any. Of course, there are some. I mean, like hitting children is not there. Even the punishments of criminal law are seldomly mentioned in the Quran. There are other texts, but not in the Quran. Anyway, I think that humans, as we know through the Quran, the human is created weak. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. And I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, is considerate of that weakness and deals with us in accordance to our weakness. And therefore, of course, we know and we understand that God is the most just, but He is also the most merciful. Mercy even overdoes the wrath of God, as it says in the Hadith. So I mean that in the end, the last goal or the last vision of any Muslim vision is the light of the end of the tunnel, and it is God's light, and it is that mercy that we. Therefore, even Muslim scholars, like in practical teaching, they will say that yes, it is good to speak about the punishment of the hereafter for somebody in their life who is sinning, as a kind of using the stick and the carrot method. However, when somebody lies on the deathbed, we should only speak about mercy, because this is the reality in the end. So I think this is a balance that is therefore balancing different human states and different. So not all humans are acceptable of the same means, and I think that the Quran, of course, as a universal message for all times and all places, it will need to give tools and give means that can deal with different people in different ways. And I think, however, the end of all people is this vision of mercy in the end of the world.
And it's also extraordinary how out of the same situation, different outcomes can occur. Two children brought up in almost exactly the same way. One will flourish and benefit from hardship in some way, and another will crumble and go under. This is a question of individual destiny, and it's a very deep and difficult one to understand. But so it isn't a question necessarily of what happens to someone. It's a question of how they deal with it, and you can find the most many stories, most glorious outcomes from a difficult, terrible situation that have occurred, and someone else will collapse under it and destroy themselves. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But it isn't simply a question of what happens to you, it's a question of what you do with what happens to you. What the individual person does with what happens.
I was thinking of more how to act. Like, for example, like any kind of punishment.
Follow your heart.
Yeah, but does this also like?
I have three children. You must follow your heart, and then you will be judged maybe later, or I don't know. But
so
you must follow your heart.
On that question, maybe we can also have an individual conversation, because it's interesting. Maybe here?
Yes, I think it was very interesting. But how was the prophet? He was a father too. How was he?
How was the prophet with his father? How was the
Did he punish them, and how did they?
No, of course not. What we know of the Prophet peace be upon him, and we see him as the role model. It is said very clearly that he never lifted his hand or his voice towards any child or woman or human being at all, except for in the time of war. So it is. This is the most preferable upbringing, the upbringing of mercy and kindness. Of course, this is. I think this is generally known in the Muslim tradition, and I think that the Prophet ﷺ exemplified even his way of dealing. It is mentioned in one hadith, one tradition, that the Prophet was kissing his children, his grandchildren, and playing with them and so on. So one of the Bedouins, and the Bedouins were known to have a very extreme patriarchal, harsh culture, even in those times. So he was saying to the Prophet, I have 10 children, I've never kissed any of them. And the Prophet ﷺ answered him, what can I do if you've been bereft all mercy? So it is, of course, the whole issue of masculinity, of being a father, and the traits of the fatherhood, I think is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and is a problem within Muslim communities and Muslim culture. If we call them Muslim cultures, it's a huge problem. And still today, I've met people, for instance, from the Balkans, that say that if you're seen as playing with your children, you're seen as not a real man, which is the opposite of what the Prophet ﷺ did. He would pray, he would even leave the sermon, that he was standing in sermon, he would leave it for his grandchildren and pick them up. They would play with him during the most holy of in the prayer. They would climb on him and bang on, and this is, I think, again, mercy is, the trait of mercy, al-Rahmah, is the most obvious trait in Islam, without a doubt. Every Quran, except one, the surah in the Quran, begins with it. The number of times it's mentioned in the Quran, the Prophet is named mercy several times in the Quran, and leniency of heart that is mentioned in the Quran, so on, so on. I think that.
Can I just,
Yeah.
when you say that he didn't hit his children, can I say that is the sunnah of the Prophet?
Yes, of course. Of course, this is the sunnah of
So-
the
I
Prophet.
mean, the sunnah is, it's just a very short note, that he didn't even, Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he didn't even say to his people, if something had been done, why did you do that?
Yes.
He didn't even do that. And subhanAllah, like living in a relationship where one can learn not to blame each other at all, whether it's children, husband, wives, father, mothers, and whoever one has around, neighbors. That's amazing. It's very hard to do, but it is a thing we practice as much as we can. We don't even say, why did you do that? Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he never did. He never blamed anybody, for what was happening. And that's a big learning, and that is what we must take in, inshallah.
Thank you, Hannah. That's a very good. I think, we Germans were very obsessed about timing and organization and so on, because we went quite a bit about our timeline. I think I would close this meeting here now. Invite everybody to join us the whole evening and through, basically, to find out more about several kinds of questions. I think that's the last point, which is the introduction of your.
Yes.
So should we have a 5 minutes break and then?
No, just,
Or should we-
no,
No.
just continue.
Yeah, should we just continue? Okay, thank you very much. Shaykh Salahuddin.